The lights at the Sands Casino were hot enough to melt glass, and in the Copa Room on this January night in 1961, they illuminated something that looked like paradise. Cigarette smoke curled like ghosts above the crowd as the orchestra hit that first brassy sting. The high rollers leaned forward in their velvet chairs, martinis catching the amber glow, pearls gleaming against silk gowns. This was the summit of American cool, the place where dreams came to dance with reality. Then he walked out, Dean Martin in an immaculate tux, tied just loose enough to suggest he didn't take any of this too seriously, that lazy half-grin already getting laughs before he opened his mouth. To the audience, he was a comfortable kind of immortality. The clink of ice in their glasses, the velvet of his voice sliding over familiar melodies, the way he pretended to stumble, to forget, to be just drunk enough to be charming, this was the magic they'd paid for. Tonight, Dean wasn't just a man. He was a feeling, a promise that the world, at least for an hour, could be simple and smooth and safe. He made difficulty look effortless, made loneliness sound like a love song, made heartbreak feel like a gentle joke between friends. But behind the curtain, the world was anything but simple. An envelope sat on his dressing room table, heavy with the weight of history. Cream-colored paper. Presidential seal. The kind of invitation that transformed entertainers into legends. The President of the United States requests the pleasure of your company at the inaugural gala. For any performer in 1961, this was the summit, proof that you had crossed from nightclub smoke into the clean white corridors of power. Frank Sinatra had orchestrated the whole thing, had bled for this moment, charmed for it, worked every connection to make the Rat Pack the cultural architects of Camelot. But that afternoon, the dream had curdled into nightmare. Sammy Davis Jr., the most electric man to ever command a spotlight, the one who had campaigned harder for Kennedy than almost anyone in Hollywood, would not be attending the inauguration. Not because he wasn't talented enough, not because he wasn't famous enough. Sammy had committed an unforgivable sin in the eyes of Kennedy's advisors. He had married the woman he loved. My Brit. A white woman, a Swedish actress with blonde hair and blue eyes. And somewhere between the ballroom and the back room, between politics and prejudice, the decision came down. There would be no place for that kind of love in the inauguration photographs. The call had reached Frank first. The chairman of the board, the man who could move mountains with a phone conversation, couldn't get his friend through the door. The answer was final. Sammy was out. Frank had broken the news with the kind of pain that only comes from watching power reveal its true face. Dean looked at that invitation, understanding exactly what it meant, and more importantly, what it didn't mean for his friend. The band was warming up. The crowd was settling in, preparing to surrender their troubles to his effortless charm. But in that narrow corridor backstage, something shifted in the man they called the King of Cool. The mask of the charming drunk fell away, revealing something older, something unbreakable. Without fanfare, without speeches, without cameras rolling, Dean Martin picked up that presidential invitation and tore it in half. Then in half again. Slowly, deliberately, the way you destroy something that was never really yours to begin with. Years later, a former White House aide would remember the message that arrived the next morning. A grandson would find the torn pieces preserved in a box of his grandfather's most treasured possessions. And Sammy Davis Jr. would tear up in interviews, decades later, talking about the friend who chose loyalty over the most powerful invitation in America. In a world that only ever wanted Dean Martin to be charming, drunk, and untouchable, this was the night he chose, quietly, to be something else entirely. Heroic. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy. But stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to January 1961, inside that cramped dressing room at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. The year was 1960, and America was dancing on the edge of something magnificent. In the Copa Room at the Sands Hotel, cigarette smoke curled like incense around the altar of American cool, where 5 men in tuxedos had somehow convinced an entire nation that rebellion could look like elegance. The Rat Pack wasn't just entertainment. They were an unauthorized branch of government, a monarchy in mohair suits. Frank Sinatra burned with the intensity of a man who believed his own mythology, all ambition and volatility, demanding the world's attention through sheer force of will. Sammy Davis Jr. was pure electricity, the most talented human being to ever draw breath, dancing on the razor's edge between brilliance and exhaustion, chasing something inside himself that never seemed to rest. But Dean Martin was something else entirely. While Frank stormed and Sammy exploded, Dean drifted through the chaos as if gravity were optional, as if life itself were some gentle joke only he understood. The world saw the drink in his hand, the stumble in his step. The tie loosened just enough to suggest he didn't believe in effort, and they called him the King of Cool. It was the greatest acting performance of the 20th century, because the glass was usually filled with apple juice, and the stumble was calculated to the millimeter. Inside that immaculate tuxedo lived Dino Crescetti from Steubenville, Ohio, the son of Italian immigrants who had arrived in America with nothing but calloused hands and unshakable hope. Dean had grown up watching his father navigate a world that saw Italians as criminals or clowns, nothing in between. He'd hauled bootleg liquor through back alleys, dealt cards in smoke-filled rooms where a wrong look could cost you your teeth, learned early that dignity wasn't given but claimed in small moments when nobody was watching. These weren't lessons he discussed in interviews or turned into anecdotes for talk shows. They were the bedrock of who he was, hidden beneath layers of charm and carefully cultivated indifference. Which is why, when Dean looked at Sammy Davis Jr., he didn't see a talented performer or a useful friend. He saw a brother navigating an even crueler version of the same prejudice Dean's family had faced. Sammy was everything America claimed to celebrate, yet the world still tried to diminish him at every turn. While their onstage banter could sound ruthless, offstage Dean became Sammy's fiercest protector. When hotels refused Sammy a room, Dean refused to perform. When restaurants seated Sammy by the kitchen, Dean walked out. No speeches, no declarations, just quiet acts of solidarity that spoke louder than any headline. By the time young Senator John F. Kennedy came courting their cultural currency, this private world was about to collide with something much larger. Kennedy needed what the Rat Pack had in endless supply: effortless, modern, dangerous charisma. The boys loved it, especially Frank, who saw destiny in every handshake and campaign rally. At one of the first events where politics and show business formally embraced, the room glowed with promise. The crowd roared for Frank's anthems, gasped at Sammy's impossible spins, melted under Dean's velvet baritone. But in the wings, Dean noticed something else. While the music played and the applause swelled, he watched the eyes of the men in dark suits surrounding the future president. He saw the thin, polite smiles that never touched their eyes when Sammy walked by, the way they stepped just a little farther back when he extended his hand. The gambler in Dean, the man who played drunk so he could see everything with sober clarity, felt it in his bones. A tiny fracture in the shining surface. A reminder that no matter how bright the lights, the old shadows were still standing in the corner, waiting for their moment to reclaim the room. They started calling it the Jack Pack, and for those electric months of 1960, it felt like revolution disguised as a nightclub act. The Rat Pack had successfully hijacked the American political machine, transforming dusty campaign rallies into cultural events that made democracy look like the coolest party the country had ever been invited to attend. Frank Sinatra poured his entire soul into the campaign, seeing in Kennedy not just a politician, but a brother-in-arms who could drag America into a braver, more elegant future. They raised millions through sheer force of charisma, turning political obligation into genuine excitement, making the old world of gray, careful politics suddenly swing with rhythm and hope. In the middle of that beautiful storm was Sammy Davis Jr., working harder than anyone, bleeding for a cause that promised to love him back. Sammy knew what it meant for a black man to be seen standing shoulder to shoulder with a future president, and he threw himself into the machinery of democracy with desperate hope. He would finish a rally in the South, bringing the House down with his impossible talent, then watch as the local Democratic officials who had just applauded him disappeared into whites-only restaurants, while Sammy climbed back onto the bus. He'd perform in cities where he couldn't eat at the same lunch counters as the people cheering for him, swallow humiliation night after night, smile through the side entrances and back elevators and second-tier rooms. He never complained, never slowed down. This was bigger than his own dignity, he told himself. This was about opening doors for everyone who looked like him. Then My Britt walked into his life like sunlight through a broken window. The Swedish actress with hair like spun gold and eyes that held something genuine in a town built on beautiful lies. She didn't grow up under Jim Crow, didn't know the particular American music of slurs murmured under breath and doors closed without explanation. She just knew that Sammy made her laugh, made her think, made her feel more alive than anyone she'd ever met. Their romance was immediate, overwhelming, the kind of love that makes people forget the world exists. But the rest of the country remembered, and the backlash began immediately. Hate mail arrived in sacks, heavy with venom and threats. Anonymous voices on telephones promised violence. Network executives shifted uncomfortably. Sponsors grew nervous. Even within the Democratic Party he'd been helping so fiercely, there were whispers that this could be a problem, that this was too much. Not now, not with the South watching. In November 1960, just days after Kennedy won the presidency by the thinnest of margins, Sammy and Mai did the most reckless, honest thing two people can do. They got married. No apology, no secrecy, no compromise. Sammy stood at that altar and chose love over safety, hope over fear, believing that the America he'd been campaigning for might actually be arriving. But behind closed doors in Washington, the architects of Camelot looked at polling data and decided that progress had a speed limit. The whispers in corridors of power turned into shouts behind closed doors. They talked about optics, about timing, about not alienating certain voters. They didn't say race or prejudice. They didn't have to. The phone call didn't come to Sammy. It came to Frank Sinatra. The chairman of the board, the man who believed he was the puppet master of this new era, picked up the receiver expecting gratitude. Instead, he heard the cold, metallic voice of political expediency. The message was devastatingly simple. Sammy could not attend the inauguration. The president-elect could not afford to be photographed next to a black man married to a white woman. Frank stood there, the receiver feeling like lead in his hand, blood draining from his face. For the first time in his life, the chairman of the board had no move. He had to choose between the President of the United States and the man who had stood by him when Hollywood left him for dead. And in that terrible, quiet moment, Frank realized that no amount of money or fame could buy his way out of this betrayal. The words came out of Frank Sinatra's mouth like broken glass, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. He had rehearsed this conversation during the sleepless drive across Los Angeles, but there was no version that didn't feel like betrayal. Sammy sat across from him in the corner booth of a nearly empty restaurant, the kind of place where famous men could disappear into shadows and speak truths that would never make headlines. Frank tried to dress it up with the language they'd given him, those careful phrases about advisors and Southern voters and sensitive timing. But every euphemism landed with the same brutal force. Not welcome, not safe for the photographs, not the right image for Camelot. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Sammy didn't move. His face arranged itself into that familiar expression he'd perfected over decades, half amused, half surprised, ready to transform pain into performance. Then came that impossible Sammy Davis Jr. smile, the one that could make strangers feel like family, and he told Frank it was fine, really. He understood the position everyone was in. His voice never wavered, never cracked, honoring the performance even in his devastation. But his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly as they reached for a cigarette he never lit. When he excused himself to the restroom, Frank sat alone listening to the muffled sounds of a man breaking in private and wanted to disappear into the floor. The chairman of the board spent the next 72 hours burning up telephone lines to Washington, calling in every favor accumulated over 3 decades of making powerful men feel important. He screamed at Peter Lawford, pleaded with Bobby Kennedy's people, offered compromises that grew more desperate with each rejection. Sammy could attend but avoid photographers. He could come to a secondary event. He could exist in the margins of his own triumph. But each conversation ended the same way, with polite refusals wrapped in the velvet language of segregation, the kind of discrimination that strangled just as effectively as any rope because it wore a suit and spoke in reasonable tones about optics and timing. Dean Martin learned about it the way he learned about most things that mattered, not from headlines or official announcements, but from watching the people he loved. He saw Sammy's performance that night, technically flawless but emotionally hollow, the manic spark behind his eyes dimmed to something mechanical. He saw Frank drinking for real, not the stage prop version, the glass trembling in his hand as he stared at nothing. Dean didn't need explanations. He'd grown up watching his father navigate a world that saw Italians as criminals or clowns, nothing in between. He recognized the particular cruelty of being told you didn't belong in rooms you'd helped build. Something shifted in Dean Martin that night, a tectonic movement deep beneath the surface of his legendary cool. He didn't explode or lecture or demand meetings with Kennedy's people. Instead, he got quiet in a way that made everyone nervous, the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes. At home, Jean watched her husband sit in his den with actual whiskey, not the apple juice he carried on stage, staring at nothing with unusual intensity. She knew this look, had seen it maybe 3 times in their marriage when something fundamental had been violated. When the organizers called to confirm his attendance at the inauguration, Dean's voice was pleasant, almost bored. He'd think about it, he said. Let them know soon. But inside, the decision was already made. He thought about his father's calloused hands, about the back entrances Sammy had endured, about what his children would remember when the applause finally stopped. For Dean, morality was never a performance. It was a private decision made in the quiet, when no one was keeping score. The cream-colored envelope arrived 2 days later, heavy with the weight of history and power. Dean held it for a long time, understanding exactly what it represented and what it would cost to refuse it. Then Dean Martin, the man who made everything look effortless, made the easiest decision of his life. He didn't go where his friends weren't welcome. It was that simple and that absolute. The sound of paper tearing is surprisingly loud in an empty room, especially when that paper carries the weight of history. Dean Martin sat alone in his dressing room at the Sands. The cream-colored invitation spread before him like evidence of something fundamentally broken in the American dream. Outside, the orchestra was warming up, running through arrangements they could play in their sleep, while the crowd settled into their velvet chairs, preparing to surrender their troubles to his effortless charm. But in this narrow corridor backstage, time seemed suspended as Dean picked up that presidential invitation and began to destroy it with the deliberate care of a surgeon removing something malignant. He didn't rip it in anger or haste. There was no dramatic flourish, no raised voice, no smashed glass against the wall. Instead, he tore it cleanly in half, the sound sharp and final in the silence. Then he folded the pieces together and tore them again. And again, each deliberate cut was a rejection not just of the invitation itself, but of the entire system that could smile at Sammy Davis Jr. on stage and then erase him from the photographs. Dean had grown up watching his father navigate a world that saw Italians as criminals or clowns, nothing in between. He recognized the particular cruelty of being told you belonged everywhere except the places that mattered. Now he was watching the same machinery crush his friend, dressed in the velvet language of political necessity. What remained on his dressing room table looked like confetti, meaningless fragments of what had once been the most powerful invitation in America. But the weight, oddly, had lifted from Dean's shoulders. He reached for hotel stationery, the cheap kind with the Sands logo stamped at the top, and uncapped his pen. His handwriting, usually fast and casual, became slow and deliberate as he composed what might have been the most important message of his career. He didn't write much, Dean never believed in cluttering the truth. He thanked them graciously for the honor, acknowledged the historic significance of the moment, then delivered the only sentence that mattered. I find myself unable to attend any celebration where my friends are not welcome. No grand speeches about justice or equality. No political manifestos that would make headlines. Just a simple statement that cut through all the careful language of advisors and pollsters to the raw truth underneath. Tommy Rizzo, a young stagehand who had been working the Copa room for 3 years, was passing by when he noticed the unusual silence coming from Dean's dressing room. In all his time at the Sands, he'd never known Dean to be late for a call. Tommy knocked softly, and Dean emerged looking exactly as he always did. Tuxedo immaculate, tie loosened just enough, that familiar half-smile already settling into place. But as Tommy stepped aside to let him pass, he caught a glimpse of the torn invitation scattered across the dressing room table, the presidential seal visible on one of the larger fragments. Dean paused at the doorway, caught Tommy's wide-eyed stare, and offered a small, sad wink. It was a moment of quiet complicity, a silent acknowledgement that something historic had just happened in the shadows where history rarely bothered to look. Tommy sealed the envelope Dean handed him, addressed back to the inauguration organizers, understanding without being told that this message needed to reach its destination immediately. Decades later, when Tommy was an old man telling stories to his grandchildren, he would remember the look on Dean's face in that moment, not angry or righteous, just quiet and certain, like a man who had finally stopped pretending something didn't hurt. Dean walked onto that stage and delivered a performance that would have convinced strangers nothing had changed. The jokes landed with surgical precision. The songs floated through the smoky air like velvet. He stumbled at exactly the right moments, forgot lyrics with impeccable timing, made the impossible look effortless. But Joey Bishop, watching from the wings, felt something different in the room, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that he couldn't quite identify. The band noticed it too, something in Dean's eyes between songs, a distance that hadn't been there before, as if he was performing from behind glass. The audience never suspected that the man making them laugh had just quietly refused the President of the United States, had chosen loyalty over the most powerful invitation in America. The message hit the White House the next morning like a cold shock. There was immediate panic among the organizers, frantic calls between Washington and Las Vegas, trying to understand what had gone wrong, whether this could be contained or spun or somehow transformed into something less politically damaging. Losing Sammy had been a calculated risk, an ugly but manageable sacrifice to Southern sensibilities. But losing Dean Martin was a disaster nobody had anticipated. This wasn't just losing a performer. This was losing the embodiment of American cool, the man who made power look relaxed and rebellion look elegant. Some junior aides suggested they could explain it as a scheduling conflict, but everyone in the room understood what this really meant. Dean Martin had looked at the summit of American power and decided his friend's dignity was worth more. When Kennedy himself read the brief, devastatingly polite note, he reportedly set it down and stared out the window for a long moment. He was a politician, calculating and pragmatic, but he was also a man who understood loyalty. There was something like grudging respect in his reaction, mixed with the frustration of a leader who realized he had pushed a fundamentally decent man too far. The crack in Camelot's facade was hairline thin, but it ran deeper than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Frank Sinatra learned about it through the Whisper network that connected Vegas to Washington, and his reaction was a complicated storm of emotions he couldn't fully articulate. Part of him felt something like awe at Dean's quiet courage, the kind of defiance that required no audience or applause. But another part felt the sting of being shown up, of realizing that while he'd been negotiating and compromising and trying to preserve his access to power, Dean had simply walked away from it all without looking back. Frank was still going to the inauguration, still playing the game, but knowing that his friend had done the thing Frank wished he had the courage to do. When Sammy Davis Jr. found out what Dean had done, he locked himself in his dressing room and wept. Not the performance tears he could summon on command for a particularly moving song, but the raw, ugly crying of a man who had spent his entire life proving he deserved basic human dignity, only to discover that his friend had sacrificed everything to defend it without being asked. In a world that constantly told him he was almost enough, Dean Martin had said, without hesitation, that Sammy was essential. That night, when they finally met backstage, no words were exchanged. The look in Dean's eyes said everything that needed saying. They stood together, or they didn't stand at all. The King of Cool had made his choice, and it wasn't the White House. It was the man who had always been welcome at his table, in his home, in his heart. Presidential approval be damned. The years that followed moved like water over stone, slowly reshaping the landscape of their lives in ways that only became visible when you looked back from a distance. Dean and Sammy continued performing together, their friendship deepened by something that couldn't be manufactured on stage or written into a script. The torn invitation was never discussed between them, because men like Dean Martin didn't require gratitude for doing what was right. But everyone who knew them could see the difference, could feel the particular gravity that existed in their silence when they stood side by side. It was the weight of a debt that could never be repaid because it had never been asked for in the first place. In 1990, 3 decades after that January night in Las Vegas, a television crew sat down with an aging Sammy Davis Jr. for what would become one of his final interviews. The conversation meandered through the usual territory of show business memories and Rat Pack nostalgia. But when the interviewer mentioned Dean's name, something shifted in Sammy's expression. His voice, still powerful despite illness, began to crack as he talked about the inauguration that never was. He described Dean's gesture with the reverence usually reserved for sacred texts, his eyes filling with tears he didn't bother to hide. "People think Dean is indifferent," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They think he doesn't care about anything. But let me tell you something. When it mattered, when it really mattered, he was the only one who stood up. He didn't make a speech. He just stood. More than any standing ovation, more than any award accumulated over 6 decades in show business, that moment of solidarity had meant everything. The inauguration incident was not a one-time act of rebellion, but the beginning of a pattern that would define the rest of Dean's life. When a black stagehand was denied service at a restaurant near a venue where Dean was performing, he quietly moved the entire production to a different location without making a public statement. A lighting technician, facing surgery he couldn't afford, told his grandson years later about the anonymous check that had arrived at the hospital, signed only with a small drawn martini glass. An aging showgirl recalled the week when Dean quietly covered her rent after her husband died, never mentioning it again, never letting it become part of his official story. He established college funds for the children of crew members who died unexpectedly, paid medical bills for people whose names never appeared in credits, supported causes that would never generate headlines or tax deductions. This was Dean's true performance, the one that happened in the darkness, where no cameras could follow. For Dean, the consequences of that torn invitation rippled through his career in ways both subtle and profound. Certain doors that had been opening suddenly closed without explanation. Political events that would have naturally included the King of Cool found reasons to look elsewhere. The machinery of power has a long memory for those who refuse to play along, and Dean's quiet defiance marked him as unreliable in the eyes of people who valued access over integrity. While Frank Sinatra eventually had his own messy public falling out with the Kennedy family over different grievances, Dean had already drawn his line in the sand years earlier, had already decided that there were things more valuable than proximity to presidents. He watched Frank's turbulence from a distance, offering support but never judgment, secure in the knowledge that he had made his choice long ago. Within the Martin household, the story of the torn invitation became something like family scripture, passed down through generations with the weight of moral instruction. Dean's children learned that character wasn't about what you said when the cameras were rolling. It was about what you did when nobody was watching. Most remarkably, Dean kept one half of that torn invitation in his wallet for the rest of his life, a small piece of cream-colored paper with the presidential seal still visible. He never showed it to anyone, never explained why he carried it. It wasn't a trophy. It was a compass, a tangible piece of evidence that in a life built on make-believe, there had been moments of absolute, terrifying reality where he had chosen correctly. Today, when the world remembers Dean Martin, it reaches for the comfortable fiction first. He's the drunk uncle of the Rat Pack, the one who seemed to take nothing seriously, who stumbled through life with a glass in his hand and a joke on his lips. The documentary clips show him forgetting lyrics with perfect timing, pretending to be more intoxicated than he was, making difficulty look like a happy accident. This is the Dean Martin that pop culture has preserved in amber, safely packaged as the guy who made indifference look charming, who turned apathy into an art form. It's a version that fits neatly into highlight reels and comedy compilations, but it's also a ghost, a performance so convincing that it has outlived the truth of the man who created it. The reality, slowly emerging through decades of stories told by people who had no reason to lie, paints a radically different portrait. After Dean's death in 1995, his family began discovering the systematic architecture of compassion he had built in the shadows, a network of quiet generosity that stretched back decades. There were college funds established for children whose parents had worked a single day on one of his film sets. Medical bills paid for crew members he barely knew. A retired makeup artist discovered that Dean had been paying her mother's nursing home bills for the final decade of her life, routing the payments through so many intermediaries that the source had been deliberately obscured. A struggling musician learned that the scholarship that had changed his son's trajectory had come from Dean Martin's personal account. His accountant once estimated that Dean had given away more money anonymously than most successful entertainers earned in their entire careers. But Dean never discussed it, never kept records beyond what the ears required, treating his wealth as a tool for solving problems rather than a scorecard. For measuring success. These weren't publicity stunts or tax strategies. Dean went to extraordinary lengths to ensure his generosity remained invisible, understanding something profound that our current moment has largely forgotten, that true charity doesn't require an audience, and if you need recognition for doing the right thing, you're probably doing it for the wrong reasons. In an era where every act of kindness is documented for social media, where virtue must be performed to exist, Dean Martin's approach to heroism feels almost revolutionary. He understood that real cool isn't about not caring. It's about caring so deeply that you don't need to shout about it. It's about possessing a moral center so heavy and stable that the chaos of the world simply breaks against it like waves against a cliff. The cameras weren't rolling when he tore up that invitation. There was no press release announcing his solidarity. Just a man in a dressing room, making a decision that would cost him access to power, but preserve something more valuable than any political connection. After Dean passed away on Christmas morning in 1995, his daughter Deanna was going through his personal effects when she discovered a small leather wallet, worn smooth by decades of being carried in his pocket. Inside, folded carefully between photographs of his children and a snapshot of Sammy taken backstage at the Sands, she found the torn pieces of that presidential invitation. He had kept them all those years, preserved like a relic, though he had never once mentioned their existence. The cream-colored paper had yellowed with age, the presidential seal faded but still visible, a tangible reminder of the line he had drawn between celebrity and character. Deanna held those fragments in her hands and understood, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what her father had carried so lightly. This wasn't a trophy or a conversation piece. It was evidence of the moment when Dean Martin chose to be something more than an entertainer, when he decided that some things mattered more than the most exclusive invitation in the world. The story of Dean Martin and that torn invitation matters now more than ever, not because it's a feel-good tale of celebrity goodness, but because it reveals something essential about the nature of integrity. We still need people willing to tear up the invitation. We still need people who understand that loyalty is worth more than access, that character trumps celebrity, that the most important performances happen off stage when nobody is watching but somebody is counting on you to do the right thing. The entertainment industry has changed beyond recognition since that night in 1961, but the fundamental human need for quiet courage remains constant. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, turning pain into punchlines and loneliness into love songs. But in that dressing room in January 1961, he revealed the truth that had been hiding beneath the performance all along. The mask of the charming drunk was his greatest act, but the moment he tore up that invitation and chose his friend over the president was the moment Dean Martin became immortal. Not as an entertainer, but as a man who understood that integrity isn't something you perform. It's something you live, quietly, in the darkness, when the only witness is your own conscience and the only applause is the sound of your own heart telling you that you did the right thing. He created an invisible architecture in other people's lives, a framework of dignity and compassion that outlasted every song he ever sang. The lights are still shining on stages across America. The music still plays in casinos and concert halls. But now when we look back at that era of American cool, we can see beyond the performance to the man underneath. Not just the king of cool, but the quiet king of conscience. The one who taught us that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to play the game. And that's true. Immortality isn't found in the spotlight, but in the moments when you choose love over power, friendship over fame, and character over everything else the world thinks it wants to give you.